I waited 3 years to watch my brother lose everything. Not because I'm cruel, because I needed him to understand what it feels like when the people who are supposed to protect you decide you're disposable. My name is Maya, and for most of my childhood, I was the good daughter, the one who studied hard, kept her head down, and believed that if you worked for something, you earned it. My brother Ethan was different. He was charming in that effortless way some people are, the kind of person who could talk his way into anything and out of everything. Our parents adored him, not in a quiet way, in the way that made it clear whose dreams mattered more. I was 16 when my grandfather died and left me $50,000 for college. He'd always told me I reminded him of my grandmother, who never got the education she deserved. He'd been a machinist for 40 years, saving quietly, never spending on himself. When he died of a heart attack in his workshop, surrounded by tools he'd used since before I was born, he left behind 2 things: a paid-off house that went to my father, and that college fund that went to me. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office in Bellingham, Washington, where we'd lived my whole life, watching Mr. Patterson explain the trust. My grandfather had been specific. The money was for my education, held in trust until I turned 18, managed by my parents as custodians. It was mine, legally, irrevocably mine. At least, that's what the paperwork said. My mother cried that day. She said her father had always believed in education, that he'd wanted to go to college himself, but never had the chance. My father put his hand on my shoulder and said I'd make Grandpa proud. Ethan wasn't there. He was 22 then, working part-time at a friend's brewery and living in our parents' basement while he figured out his next move. He dropped out of Western Washington University halfway through his junior year, said college wasn't for people like him, people with vision. The fund sat there through my junior and senior year of high school like a promise. I checked the balance every month online, watching the interest accumulate. $50,000. It felt like freedom. It felt like proof that someone believed in me enough to invest in my future without conditions, without comparisons to my brother. I got accepted to the University of Washington with a partial academic scholarship that covered about 40% of tuition. The fund would cover the rest, plus room and board, plus books if I was careful. I made spreadsheets, color-coded spreadsheets. I calculated every semester down to the dollar, including a small emergency buffer. I could graduate debt-free if I was smart about it. I could start my adult life without the weight that crushed so many of my classmates. I should have known it was too good to be true. 3 months before I was supposed to move into my dorm in Seattle, my mother asked me to come home early from my summer job at the public library. She said it was important. Family meeting. I remember the way my stomach dropped when I walked into the house and saw everyone already sitting in the living room. Formal seating. My parents on the couch, Ethan in the armchair by the window, wearing a button-down shirt he'd clearly borrowed from our father because it didn't fit right across the shoulders. Mom asked me to sit down. Her voice had that careful quality it got when she was about to say something she knew I wouldn't like. My father stared at his hands. That should have been my first warning. Dad was a mechanic, worked at the same shop for 26 years, and he never avoided eye contact unless he was ashamed of something. She started talking about opportunities, about how rare it was for someone like Ethan, someone creative and driven, to find the right path. She said he'd been working on something for months, something real, a business plan. He'd put together this whole proposal for a specialty coffee roasting company. Small batch, ethically sourced, direct trade relationships with farmers in Guatemala and Ethiopia. He'd done market research. He had potential investors. He just needed seed money to get started, to prove the concept viable. I didn't understand at first. I asked what that had to do with me. The pause that followed felt like falling. My mother took a breath and said they'd made a decision as a family. Well, as the adult members of the family, Ethan needed $25,000 to launch his business. They'd explored every option. Banks wouldn't lend to him without collateral. Their own savings were tied up in the mortgage and retirement accounts they couldn't touch without penalties. But the college fund was just sitting there, not being used yet, and I wouldn't need it all at once anyway. I remember asking if she was telling me what I thought she was telling me. She said they'd taken $25,000 from my college fund. Half of it, gone. Transferred 3 days ago into an LLC Ethan had set up called Elevation Coffee Roasters. The room tilted. I heard myself ask if they were joking, even though I knew they weren't. My father finally looked up and said it wasn't a joke. It was an investment in family. Ethan's business would grow and eventually support all of us. I was smart, he said, like Grandpa always said. I could get student loans like everyone else. I could work part-time. Lots of kids did both. But Ethan needed this capital now, and opportunities like this didn't wait for convenient timing. I asked if it was even legal, if they were allowed to just take money from a trust that had my name on it. My mother's face changed, got harder. She said they were my parents, that the money was under their control until I turned 18, which wouldn't happen for another 8 weeks. She said I was being selfish, that I should want my brother to succeed, that this was what families did. They helped each other rise. I looked at Ethan. He was staring at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Not guilt, exactly. More like he was daring me to object. I asked him what made him think he could run a coffee business. He'd never finished college. He'd never held a job for more than a year. What made this different from the food truck idea he'd abandoned, or the graphic design business that never got past making a logo? His jaw tightened. He said I wouldn't understand because I'd never tried to build something. I just followed rules and checked boxes. He said this was real. He had suppliers lined up, a location scouted, investors waiting. He said he'd pay me back. He promised, once the business was profitable, he'd make sure I got every penny back, maybe even with interest. My mother reached across and took my hand. She said I had to trust them, that they'd never steer me wrong, that this was an opportunity to lift the whole family up. I was 17 years old. 17 years and 10 months. 8 weeks from legal adulthood. 8 weeks from having any say in my own financial future. And half of what my grandfather had left me was already gone. Handed to my brother like it was a graduation gift. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I pulled my hand away from my mother and said okay. She looked relieved. My father nodded like I'd finally understood something fundamental about how the world worked. Ethan leaned back in the chair and said I wouldn't regret this. That one day I'd tell people I was there at the beginning of something special. I said okay again and went upstairs to my room. I didn't mean okay. I meant I was done arguing with people who'd already made their choice. I meant I was learning something crucial about my family that I'd suspected but never fully accepted. In their eyes, I was the safe bet, the one who'd figure it out, the one who didn't need help because I'd never asked for it. Ethan was the wild card, the one with potential that just needed the right circumstances to bloom, and they decided his potential was worth more than my certainty. So I said okay, and I started planning. The next 8 weeks were strange. I went through the motions of my last summer at home, shelving books at the library, having dinners with my family, pretending everything was normal. My parents treated me like I'd gotten over it, like my acceptance had been real. Ethan started posting on social media about his business, these long posts about ethical sourcing and supporting small farmers, and how coffee could be a force for good in the world. People I went to high school with commented with congratulations and fire emojis. Nobody congratulated me on getting into UW. I turned 18 on a Tuesday in late July. The morning of my birthday, before my parents even woke up, I logged into the trust account and transferred the remaining $25,000 to a new account I'd opened at a different bank. An account with only my name on it, no custodians, no joint access, just mine. When my mother called me around noon to say happy birthday and ask if I wanted to go to dinner, I said sure. We went to a restaurant overlooking the bay, the kind of place we only went for special occasions. Ethan came too. He gave me a card with a gift certificate to a bookstore, $25. My parents gave me a necklace that had belonged to my grandmother. Nobody mentioned the college fund. I thanked them and ate my salmon and pretended I was the same person I'd been 2 months ago. I moved to Seattle in late August. The dorm room was small, a double I shared with a girl named Rachel from Spokane, who kept her side immaculate and rarely spoke to me. I worked 20 hours a week at the campus bookstore for minimum wage, mostly stocking shelves and running the register during rush periods. I took out student loans for what the remaining fund didn't cover, $11,000 the first year. I signed the promissory notes and tried not to think about the fact that I shouldn't have needed them. I called home once a week because my mother asked me to. The conversations were surface level, classes were fine, weather was fine. Yes, I was eating enough. Yes, I was making friends. No, I didn't need anything. They talked about Ethan constantly. He'd found a small commercial space in the Fairhaven district of Bellingham, a neighborhood with brick buildings and coffee shops and art galleries. The rent was steep, but the foot traffic was good. He'd bought a roaster from a company in Portland, installed shelving, painted the walls himself. My father helped with the build-out on weekends. My mother made curtains for the windows. The grand opening was in October. I didn't go. I said I had midterms. My mother sounded disappointed but didn't push. Ethan posted photos from the opening. The place looked good, I had to admit. Exposed brick, vintage light fixtures, a chalkboard menu written in careful cursive. Bags of coffee beans lined up on wooden shelves, each one labeled with the farm it came from and tasting notes. He stood behind the counter in a black apron, grinning at the camera. The comments were full of people saying they'd stop by, that it looked amazing, that they were so proud of him. I closed the app and went back to studying accounting principles. I chose accounting because I wanted to understand exactly how money moved, how people tracked it, hid it, justified taking it. I wanted to know the language of financial systems so thoroughly that no one could ever manipulate me with numbers again. My advisor said I had an aptitude for it, said I saw patterns other students missed. I graduated in 4 years with a 3.7 gigapascals and $16,000 in debt. Not catastrophic by most standards, but every dollar of it felt personal. I got a job at a mid-size firm in Seattle doing corporate audits and tax preparation. The work was tedious, but I was good at it, good enough that I made senior associate within 3 years. I paid off my loans in aggressive chunks, throwing every spare dollar at the principal. I lived in a studio apartment in the university district that cost too much and had questionable heating. I bought my clothes from thrift stores. I meal prepped on Sundays and brought lunch to work every day. My coworkers went out for happy hour and invited me less and less when I kept saying no. By the time I was 25, I was debt-free. By the time I was 26, I had $15,000 in savings and a promotion that came with a significant raise. By the time I was 27, I'd worked on enough high-net-worth client accounts to understand how wealthy people protected their assets, how they structured loans and investments, how they used contracts and collateral to ensure they never took on risk they couldn't control. I was learning. Ethan's coffee shop lasted 2 years. For a while, it looked like it might actually work. The reviews were good. He built a small but loyal customer base. He got written up in the local alt weekly as one of the best new coffee spots in Bellingham. My parents brought it up every time I called home. Have you seen the article? Did you see his Instagram? Business is really picking up. I went once, on a rare weekend trip home for my mother's birthday. Ethan made me a cappuccino, no charge, and talked about expansion plans. He said he was thinking about opening a second location. Maybe in Seattle. He said it casually, like we were friends, like he hadn't built his dream on half of my future. I thanked him for the coffee and left. The shop closed in month 23. The window got papered over with brown craft paper. Then a for lease sign appeared. Then nothing. Just empty space. When I asked my mother what happened, she said the landlord had raised the rent and Ethan couldn't make it work. She said the market had changed. Too much competition from chains. She said a lot of things that added up to someone else's fault. I asked about the $25,000. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said Ethan had tried his best. That starting a business was hard. That most new businesses failed, and that was just reality. She said I should be proud of him for taking the risk. I asked if he was planning to pay me back. She said I needed to let it go. That holding on to resentment would only hurt me. I didn't ask again. Ethan moved back into my parents' basement at 27. He got a part-time job at a friend's brewery, working the tap room a few nights a week. He talked about his next idea, something about restaurant consulting, helping struggling establishments fix their business models. He just needed some capital to get started with marketing materials and a website. I was living in a better apartment by then, a 1-bedroom in Capitol Hill with actual heat and a kitchen that fit more than one person. I'd been promoted again. Senior auditor. I worked on complex cases, corporate restructures, merger due diligence. I was making good money, better than I'd expected at 28. My parents never asked how I was doing financially. They never asked if I'd paid off my loans or if I needed anything. Every conversation was about Ethan, his struggles, his potential, his next move. The call came on a Sunday morning in October, 2 weeks after I'd turned 28. My mother's voice on the phone had that strained quality it got when she was preparing to ask for something she knew I wouldn't want to give. She said they needed to talk to me about something important. Family business. Could I come to dinner that night? I almost said no, but I'd learned that sometimes you need to walk into the trap to spring it on your own terms. I drove north that evening, the hour-long stretch of I-5 taking me past Everett and Mount Vernon, and finally into Bellingham as the sun started to set over the bay. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. Split level, built in 1974, with cedar siding that needed painting and a deck that sagged slightly on one corner. My father's truck sat in the driveway next to Ethan's Honda, the same car he'd bought used 7 years ago and still owed money on. They were waiting for me in the dining room, not the kitchen, where we usually ate. The dining room, with the table my parents had gotten as a wedding gift and only used for Christmas and Thanksgiving. My mother had made pot roast, which meant this was serious. This was asking for something serious. We made small talk over dinner. My father asked about work. I gave vague answers about audit season and client deadlines. My mother asked if I was seeing anyone. I said no. Ethan barely looked at me, pushing food around his plate like a kid who'd been told he had to sit through a lecture before he could leave. When my mother started clearing the plates, my father cleared his throat. He said Ethan had an opportunity, a real one this time. I set down my water glass and waited. He explained that a friend of Ethan's from college, a guy named Nathan who'd gone on to get an MBA, was starting a craft distillery. Spirits were booming in the Pacific Northwest. The market for locally made gin and vodka and whiskey was exploding. Nathan had the technical knowledge and the business plan. He just needed a partner to handle operations and marketing. Someone with industry experience who understood the craft beverage scene. Ethan had that experience, my father said. The coffee shop might not have worked out, but he'd learned. He understood small batch production, ethical sourcing, branding, customer relations. This was perfect for him. There was just one problem. Nathan needed his business partner to come in with capital. $30,000. Enough to show the other investors that Ethan was serious, that he had skin in the game. My father kept talking, explaining that they'd been trying to help Ethan save up, but it wasn't happening fast enough. He was barely making rent with his brewery income. The opportunity wouldn't wait. So, they'd found a solution. They could take out a home equity loan. They'd had the house appraised and had enough equity to borrow $40,000. $30,000 for Ethan's stake in the distillery, $10,000 for operating cushion and startup costs. My mother leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. The problem was their debt-to-income ratio. They'd refinanced the house twice in the last decade, once for a new roof and once when my father's hours got cut during the recession. The bank had concerns about their ability to repay. They weren't comfortable lending the full amount without additional security. They needed a co-signer, someone with good credit and stable income. She said they'd thought of me. I looked at each of them. My father, who couldn't meet my eyes. My mother, who looked desperate. Ethan, who was staring at me with something between hope and resentment. I asked if they were serious. My father said it was just a formality. They'd make every payment. I wouldn't be responsible for anything. It was just to get the bank comfortable, my name on the loan. That's all. I wouldn't even have to think about it. I looked at Ethan and asked what happened to the $25,000 they took from my college fund, the $25,000 that was supposed to make him a successful entrepreneur. The room went completely silent. My mother's face hardened, my father's jaw clenched, Ethan's eyes narrowed. He said that was a long time ago. Ancient history. He'd tried to make the coffee shop work, but sometimes businesses failed. That wasn't his fault. This was different. This was a partnership with someone who knew what they were doing. This was real. I asked how it was different. My mother's voice got sharp, cutting. She said I'd been holding that over his head for years, that it was petty and small, that I'd gotten my education, hadn't I? I had a good job. I had a nice apartment in Seattle. I had no kids, no responsibilities, no real obligations. I was doing fine. She said family meant helping each other, that they'd always been there for me and now they needed me to be there for them. I asked if she was sure about that. If family meant helping each other, where was my help when I was working 30 hours a week and taking a full course load? Where was my help when I was choosing between buying groceries and buying textbooks? Where was my help when I graduated with debt I should never have had? My father said that was my choice, that I could have asked for help if I needed it. I almost laughed. Instead, I stood up and said no. Just no. Flat, final. My mother's eyes filled with tears. Real ones, not the manipulative kind. She said they were desperate. That they wouldn't be asking if there was any other option. That this could change everything for Ethan. For all of them. Ethan finally spoke. He said he'd pay me back this time. He swore it. He'd learned from his mistakes. This time would be different. I looked at him for a long moment and asked what collateral he was offering. He didn't understand the question. I explained it slowly, like I was talking to a client who didn't understand financial terms. If I was going to be legally responsible for a $40,000 loan that he was using to start a business that would probably fail, what was he giving me in return? What asset did he have that was worth $40,000? What could I claim if he defaulted? He said he'd sign a promissory note. I did laugh then. Not cruelly, just genuinely amused. I told him a promissory note from someone with no assets, no credit, and a failed business in his recent history wasn't worth the paper it would be printed on. Any first-year law student could tell him that. My father's voice rose. He said I was being unreasonable, that I was letting my anger at Ethan cloud my judgment. I said I wasn't angry. I was being an accountant. This was what I did for a living. I assessed risk. And this was the highest risk loan I'd ever been asked to consider. My mother stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. She said I was being cruel, that I was punishing Ethan for a mistake he'd made years ago, that I was going to regret this. I said I needed time to think about it, that I'd give them an answer in 1 week. My mother looked hopeful. My father looked suspicious. Ethan looked like he couldn't decide if he'd won or lost. I drove back to Seattle and didn't sleep that night. Not because I was conflicted, because I was doing math. I spent the next week doing research, deep research. I pulled my parents' credit report with their permission, which they gave immediately because they thought I was seriously considering the cosign. They thought I was coming around. What I found was worse than I'd expected. They were barely making their current mortgage payment. The refinances had extended their loan term, and they still had 18 years left on a house they'd lived in for 33 years. My father's income had never fully recovered from the hours cut during the recession. He was making less now, in his early 60s, than he had at 50. My mother's bookkeeping business brought in maybe $15,000 a year. Sporadic and unreliable. They had virtually no retirement savings, maybe $30,000 total between their IRAs and my father's small pension from the mechanic's shop. And they wanted to take on another $40,000 of debt to fund my brother's third business venture. I called the bank they were working with and asked questions. A lot of questions. I said I was considering co-signing and wanted to understand the full structure. The loan officer was happy to explain. The term was 10 years. The monthly payment would be about $450. If they missed even one payment, it would show up on my credit report. If they defaulted, I'd be fully liable for the entire remaining balance. I asked what would happen if they did default. The loan officer said the bank would pursue all borrowers, but as the cosigner with better credit and income, I'd likely be the primary target for collection. They could garnish my wages. They could place liens on my assets. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called my lawyer. I'd worked with Sarah on a few client matters. She was sharp, maybe 45, with gray streaks in her dark hair and a reputation for writing contracts that held up in court. I explained the situation. All of it. The college fund, the failed business, the request to co-sign. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said if I co-signed that loan as is, I was an idiot. I said I knew. She asked what I wanted to do. I told her. She was quiet again. Then she said it was possibly the most aggressive family loan structure she'd ever heard of, that it would likely destroy my relationship with my family, that I should be very sure before I went down this road. I said I was sure. She said she'd draft the documents. On Sunday evening, exactly 1 week after their dinner invitation, I called my parents. My mother answered and immediately put me on speaker so everyone could hear my answer. I said I'd thought about it carefully and I had a counteroffer. I could hear my mother's sharp intake of breath. My father said to just tell them what I wanted. I said I'd co-sign the loan on 3 conditions, all of them non-negotiable. First, Ethan would sign over 50% ownership of the distillery to me, not the startup company, not the LLC. The actual business, the physical distillery, half of every asset. If I was going to be on the hook for half the loan, I wanted half the asset, and I wanted it documented in an operating agreement that gave me equal say in all major business decisions. Second, my parents would sign a personal guarantee that made their house collateral for the loan. If they missed even a single payment, I would have the legal right to place a lien on the property. I would be first in line, ahead of the bank, if they defaulted. Third, Ethan would pay me $1,200 a month, every month, until the original $25,000 he took from my college fund was fully repaid, with interest. I'd calculated it at 5% annually from the date it was taken, which was the average return I would have gotten if the money had stayed invested. The total came to $32,800. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought they'd hung up. Then my father said I was trying to destroy the family. I said I was trying to protect myself from a bad investment. My mother said those terms were impossible, that they couldn't possibly agree to that I was asking them to risk everything. I said they were asking me to risk everything. I was just making sure the risk was equally distributed. Ethan's voice came through, tight with anger. He said I was being vindictive, that I was punishing him. I said I was being an accountant, that this was exactly how I'd structure any high-risk loan for a client. Actually, I said, for a client, I'd probably recommend even stricter terms. My father asked what would happen if they just found another co-signer. I said good luck, that I hoped they found someone willing to take on $40,000 of liability for a failing business venture. But that person wouldn't be me. My mother started crying. She said I was destroying Ethan's last chance. I said Ethan's last chance wasn't my responsibility. Then I told them they had 72 hours to decide. After that, my offer expired. I hung up. They called back 6 times that night. I sent every call to voicemail. They called 8 times the next day. I blocked their numbers temporarily and sent an email saying I'd said everything I had to say. They could respond through my lawyer. On Wednesday afternoon, my lawyer called. She said my father had contacted her, that they wanted to negotiate. I said there was nothing to negotiate. The terms were the terms. She said they were asking for modifications. Less interest on the college fund repayment, no lien on the house, 30% ownership instead of 50%. I said no to all of it. She asked if I was sure. I said I'd never been more sure of anything. Thursday passed with no word. Then Friday. I started to think they'd found another option, that they'd called my bluff. On Saturday morning, I got an email from my father. One line, "Send the papers." I forwarded it to Sarah. She drafted everything over the weekend. 4 separate documents, each one carefully structured to protect me and bind them. First, the operating agreement for Heritage Spirits LLC, the company Nathan and Ethan were forming. It gave me 50% ownership, equal voting rights, full access to financial records, and first right of refusal if Ethan ever wanted to sell his stake. Second, a personal loan agreement between Ethan and me for $32,800 to be repaid at $1,200 per month for 28 months. The agreement included provisions for late payments, default terms, and my right to pursue collection through wage garnishment if necessary. Third, a security agreement that made my parents' house collateral for the home equity loan with me as the secured party. If they missed a payment, I could file a lien immediately. If they defaulted completely, I had first claim on the property ahead of any other creditor. Fourth, a personal guarantee signed by all 3 of them acknowledging that they understood the terms and accepted full responsibility for meeting them. Sarah sent me the drafts on Sunday night. I read through each one twice, checking every clause, every provision, every word. They were perfect, ironclad, exactly what I'd asked for. I sent them to my father on Monday morning with a note. Review with a lawyer if you want. I need signed copies by Friday or the offer expires. Tuesday passed. Wednesday. Thursday morning, my mother called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered without thinking. She said they'd had a lawyer look at the documents, that the lawyer said these were the most one-sided terms he'd ever seen, that we were family and shouldn't need this level of legal protection against each other. I said if we were family, they wouldn't have stolen my college fund. She said they didn't steal it. They borrowed it for a family investment. I said borrowing implies intention to repay, that I'd never seen a penny. She started crying again and hung up. On Friday at 4:47 p.m., I received an email with scanned copies of all 4 documents, signed, notarized, legally binding. My parents' signatures looked shaky, my father's especially. Ethan's looked angry, the letters sharp and pressed hard into the paper. I forwarded everything to Sarah. She reviewed them and confirmed they were properly executed. Then she filed the security agreement with the county recorder's office, making the lien on my parents' house a matter of public record. We met at the bank the following Tuesday to sign the home equity loan documents. The loan officer seemed uncomfortable as we sat around the table, my parents on one side, me on the other, Ethan in the chair by the window. She kept glancing at her computer screen, then at us, like she couldn't quite believe this was happening. She walked us through the loan terms. $40,000. 10-year term, 6.2% interest. Monthly payment of $463. I was listed as co-signer, which meant I was equally responsible for the debt. If they missed a payment, it would damage my credit as much as theirs. I signed where she indicated. My parents signed. The loan officer witnessed and notarized. The whole process took 40 minutes. When it was done, she shook everyone's hands and said congratulations. That she hoped the business venture was successful. Nobody responded. The money was dispersed the next day. $30,000 to Heritage Spirits, LLC, $10,000 to my parents' checking account, supposedly for cushion and startup costs. I suspected at least half of that would go to catching up their own bills. I didn't hear from my family for 6 weeks after that. No calls, no texts, no invitations to Sunday dinner. I assumed they were regrouping, figuring out how to make this work, how to make me the villain in their version of events. The first payment from Ethan arrived in January, 2 months after the documents were signed. $1,200. A cashier's check with college fund repayment, month 1 written in the memo line. His handwriting. I deposited it without comment. February's payment came on the 15th instead of the 1st. Still within the grace period the agreement allowed, but telling. March's payment was on time. April's bounced. I called Ethan. He didn't answer. I texted. No response. I emailed. Nothing. I sent a formal notice through Sarah. The agreement specified that bounced checks counted as missed payments, that he owed a $50 late fee on top of the regular payment. That if he missed another payment within 6 months, I could declare the entire remaining balance immediately due. He sent a cashier's check for $1,250 3 days later. No note, no apology. May's payment was on time. June's was late, but within grace period, July's was on time. I tracked every payment in a spreadsheet, every date, every amount, every day late. I was building a record. Heritage Spirits launched in August with a small event at the distillery. I saw photos on social media. The space was impressive, I had to admit. A converted warehouse south of Bellingham with high ceilings and concrete floors, industrial chic. Large copper stills dominated one wall, gleaming and complicated. Shelving held rows of glass bottles with minimalist labels, white letters on black. Heritage Spirits, understated and expensive looking. Ethan and Nathan stood behind a makeshift bar, pouring samples. Ethan wore a black t-shirt with the company logo. He was smiling, actually smiling, in a way I hadn't seen since before the coffee shop failed. The comments were enthusiastic. People loved the gin. The vodka was smooth. The branding was on point. They'd be back. I didn't go to the launch. I wasn't invited. But as a 50% owner, I received the first monthly financial report in September. I'd written that requirement into the operating agreement. Full financial transparency. Balance sheets, profit and loss statements, cash flow projections, everything. I sat in my apartment on a Friday night and read through the numbers. They weren't good. Revenue was decent for a startup. About $8,000 in the first month from direct sales and a small distribution deal with a local liquor store. But expenses were crushing them. The equipment had cost more than projected. The licensing and permits had taken longer and cost more. The ingredients were expensive. Labor costs were higher than budgeted. Their burn rate was about $12,000 a month. They were losing $4,000 monthly. The investor money they'd raised, $30,000 from Ethan plus, matching investments from Nathan, and 2 smaller investors, wouldn't last a year at this rate. I saved the report and waited. October's numbers were slightly better. Revenue up to 11,000. Expenses down to 10,000 as they streamlined operations. They were only losing 1,000 a month. November was flat. December was worse. The holiday season should have been their best month, but revenue dropped to 9,000. Apparently, people didn't buy craft spirits as gifts as much as they'd hoped. January was terrible. Post-holiday slump. Revenue at 6,000. Expenses at 9,000. They were hemorrhaging money again. Ethan's payment to me that month was late. Very late. It arrived on January 23rd, 23 days overdue. The agreement allowed a 15-day grace period. He'd exceeded it by 8 days. I sent a formal notice of default through Sarah. The agreement specified that payments more than 15 days late triggered penalty provisions. He now owed me an additional $250, and I had the right to accelerate the entire remaining balance if he missed another payment. He called me for the first time in almost a year. His voice was strained. He said I was being unreasonable, that the business was just getting started, that cash flow was tight, that he was doing his best. I said the agreement didn't have an exception clause for tight cash flow. He said I was his sister. I said I was his creditor. He hung up. The payment for February came on February 2nd, on time, with the penalty fee included. My parents' home equity loan payment cleared every month. January, February, March. Right on time. I checked obsessively. I'd set up alerts with my bank so I'd know the moment anything changed. April's payment from my parents cleared. May's payment failed. I got the alert at 6:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. Payment returned for insufficient funds. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at my phone. This was it. The moment I'd been planning for, the moment I'd built protections around. They'd missed a payment. The security agreement was now enforceable. I didn't call them right away. I waited 3 days to see if they'd fix it themselves, if they'd scramble to make it right. On Friday, my mother called. Her voice was different, smaller. She said they'd had unexpected expenses, that my father had needed medical tests, something with his heart, possible blockage. The insurance hadn't covered everything. They'd had to pay almost $2,000 out of pocket. They didn't have it. They'd used the mortgage payment money to cover the medical bills. She said they'd make it up, that they'd have the money by the end of the month, that I just needed to be patient. I asked if she remembered what she signed. She said, of course she remembered. But this was an emergency, medical emergency. Surely I could understand that. I said the agreement didn't have an emergency exception clause. She said I couldn't be serious, that I wasn't really going to enforce this over one missed payment because of a medical situation. I said I was completely serious. Her voice changed again, got harder. She said I'd become someone she didn't recognize, that I was cold, that I cared more about money than about my own father's health. I said I cared about protecting myself from people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with financial obligations. She hung up on me. I called Sarah. She reviewed the security agreement and confirmed what I already knew. One missed payment put them in technical default. I had the legal right to place a lien on their house immediately. I asked what she recommended. She said it depended on what I wanted. If I wanted to maintain any relationship with my family, I should give them a chance to catch up. If I wanted to protect my interests, I should file immediately. I thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. I told her to file. The lien was recorded with the county on Monday morning. It made me a secured creditor on their property, second only to their primary mortgage. If they sold the house or refinanced, I'd have to be paid first. If they defaulted on the loan, I could force a sale to recover my money. My father called me that afternoon. I'd never heard him yell before. He wasn't a yelling person. Quiet, steady, conflict avoidant, but he yelled. He said I'd destroyed them, that I'd put a lien on their house, their home, the place they'd lived for over 3 decades, that it would show up on their credit report, that they'd never be able to refinance or get any other kind of loan, that I'd ruin them over one missed payment during a medical emergency. I let him finish. Then I asked if he'd read the security agreement before he signed it. He said he'd read it. I said then he knew exactly what would happen if he missed a payment. He called me a word I'd never heard him use before. Then he hung up. They made June's payment. Barely. It cleared on the 29th, one day before the end of the grace period. July's payment cleared on time. August's cleared. September's failed. This time, my mother didn't call to explain. My father didn't call to yell. Nobody called. I drove up to Bellingham on a Saturday afternoon. I didn't tell them I was coming. I just showed up and knocked on the door. My mother answered. She looked older than I remembered. Thinner. Gray had taken over most of her dark hair. She stared at me for a moment, then stepped back to let me in. My father was sitting in his recliner watching a baseball game. He didn't look at me when I walked in, just kept his eyes on the TV. I asked them what was going on. Why they'd missed another payment. My mother said they couldn't afford it anymore, that the payment was too high. That between the mortgage and the home equity loan and their regular bills, there wasn't enough money. That my father's medical issues had gotten worse. That he might need surgery. That they were drowning. I asked about Ethan. Why he wasn't helping. She laughed. It was a bitter sound. She said Ethan was barely keeping his own head above water, that the distillery wasn't making money, that he couldn't help them even if he wanted to. I asked if they'd thought about selling the house. My father finally looked at me. His expression was pure hatred. He said, I'd like that, wouldn't I? Them homeless. That would make me happy. I said them homeless wouldn't make me happy. Them honoring their obligations would make me happy. My mother said they couldn't honor their obligations, that I'd set them up to fail, that the terms I'd demanded were designed to destroy them, and I'd succeeded. I stood there in their living room, in the house I'd grown up in, and realized she was partially right. I had designed the terms to protect myself, but I'd also designed them assuming that adults would understand what they were signing, that they wouldn't take on debt they couldn't afford, that they wouldn't sacrifice their entire future for Ethan's dreams. I'd given them every opportunity to say no. They'd said yes anyway. I left without another word. Sarah called me the following week. She said my parents had hired a lawyer who was arguing that the security agreement terms were unconscionable, that I'd coerced them into signing under duress, that no court would enforce such one-sided terms against family members in financial distress. I asked what she thought. She said it was bullshit. That they'd had the opportunity to have legal counsel review the documents before signing, that they'd signed willingly, that distress didn't equal duress, that the terms might be aggressive, but they weren't illegal. She said we should fight it. I said no. She sounded surprised. She asked what I wanted to do instead. I said I wanted to restructure the loan, lower the payments to something they could actually afford, extend the term, remove the lien if they stayed current for 6 months. She asked why. I said because watching them lose their house wouldn't teach them anything they hadn't already learned, and it would make me exactly what they said I was. She said I was being more generous than they deserved. I said maybe, but I was also being strategic. The restructured agreement cut their monthly payment from $463 to $300, extended the term from 10 years to 15, gave them a path to remove the lien if they stayed current. They signed it without argument. October's payment cleared, November's cleared, December's cleared. I didn't call to congratulate them. Ethan's payments to me continued, erratic but mostly there. He missed one in December and I sent a formal notice. He made it up in January with penalty fees. By spring, he'd paid me $14,000. $14,000 out of $32,800. He had $18,000 left to go. Heritage Spirits was still struggling. The monthly reports showed slow but steady revenue growth. They'd found a few good distribution partnerships. They'd launched a bourbon that had gotten excellent reviews, but wouldn't be fully aged for another year. They were no longer losing money every month, but they weren't making much either. In June, 2 years after the distillery launched, Ethan missed another payment to me, then another, then a third. Sarah sent the formal default notice. According to the agreement, 3 missed payments within 12 months triggered my right to accelerate the entire remaining balance. He now owed me the full $18,000 immediately, and if he couldn't pay, I had the right to claim his ownership stake in the distillery as compensation. Ethan's lawyer called my lawyer. They wanted to negotiate. I said no negotiation. The terms were clear. He could pay the $18,000 immediately, or he could sign over his stake in Heritage Spirits. His lawyer argued that the ownership stake was worth far less than $18,000, that the business was barely solvent, that it wasn't fair compensation. Sarah pointed out that Ethan had agreed to these exact terms, that he'd signed the agreement knowing the consequences. That fairness wasn't relevant. 2 weeks later, I received the signed documents transferring Ethan's 50% ownership to me. I now owned 100% of Heritage Spirits. I drove up to Bellingham on a Saturday in late June. The distillery was open for tours and tastings on weekends. I walked in without announcement. Nathan was behind the bar, pouring samples for a group of tourists. He looked up when I walked in, and his expression shifted. Recognition, then confusion, then something like resignation. The tourists left with their bottles. Nathan leaned against the bar and crossed his arms. He said he'd been expecting me. I said I wanted to see the books. All of them. Not just the monthly reports. I wanted to see every transaction, every expense, every contract. He nodded and led me to a small office in the back. We spent 4 hours going through everything. Sales records, supplier contracts, equipment leases, employee timesheets, distribution agreements, marketing expenses. The truth was worse than the monthly reports suggested, but not as bad as I'd feared. They weren't failing. They were just stuck. Revenue had plateaued. Expenses were under control but not optimized. They were making enough to keep the doors open, but not enough to grow. Not enough to make a real profit. I asked Nathan what he would do differently if he had the capital. He had answers. Good ones. He'd been thinking about this. He wanted to cut the product line to focus on their 2 best sellers, the gin and a vodka infused with local botanicals. He wanted to renegotiate their distributor contracts to get better margins. He wanted to invest in a marketing consultant who specialized in craft spirits, someone who could get them into better bars and restaurants. He had numbers, projections, realistic timelines. I asked him why he'd partnered with Ethan in the first place. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said Ethan was charismatic, that he was good at selling the vision, at getting people excited. That Nathan was a behind-the-scenes person, and he thought they'd balance each other. I asked if it had worked. He laughed quietly. He said no. That Ethan was great at the launch, at the early excitement, but terrible at the day-to-day grind. That he'd stopped showing up regularly about 6 months in. That he'd been working at the distillery maybe 10 hours a week for the last year, mostly just posting on social media and showing up for events. I asked Nathan what he wanted. He said he wanted to keep running the distillery, that despite everything, he believed in the product. He just needed a real partner, someone who understood business, not just dreams. I made him an offer. I'd keep him on as a 20% owner and operating manager. I'd inject $35,000 in new capital for equipment, marketing, and operations improvements. I'd bring in the consultant I'd mentioned. In exchange, he'd run the day-to-day operations and report directly to me. He asked what happened to Ethan. I said Ethan was no longer part of the business. Nathan didn't ask for details. He just asked when we could start. I said Monday. Over the next 18 months, we rebuilt Heritage Spirits. Not into something huge, but into something sustainable. We cut the product line to 3 core offerings. We renegotiated every contract. We brought in a marketing consultant who got us placed in 18 high-end bars and restaurants across Washington. We updated the branding to be more sophisticated, less trying too hard. Revenue grew by 40% the first year, by another 30% the second year. We weren't making anyone rich, but we were profitable. Actually, genuinely profitable. I visited once a month to review finances and make strategic decisions. Nathan ran everything else. He was good at it, better than Ethan had ever been. I used the profits to pay off the remaining balance on my parents' home equity loan, not because I forgave them, because I wanted to be done with it. I wanted them to have no more leverage, no more reasons to contact me. When the final payment cleared, I had Sarah send them a formal release of the security agreement. The lien on their house was removed. They were free and clear. My mother called me the day she got the paperwork. She said thank you, that she knew I didn't have to do that. I said she was right, I didn't. She asked if we could have dinner sometime, if we could try to rebuild. I said maybe someday. She didn't push. Ethan got a job managing a restaurant in downtown Bellingham, not bartending, not part-time, a real management position with salary and benefits. I saw him once, by accident, when I was in town visiting the distillery. He was walking down the street with a woman I didn't recognize. He saw me. I saw him. We both kept walking. I'm 32 now. The distillery is in its 5th year. We're opening a 2nd tasting room in Seattle next month. Nathan is training an assistant manager so he can focus on expansion. The business is worth about $200,000, according to the last appraisal. I still own 100% of it. My parents sold their house last year and moved into a smaller place. A townhouse in a retirement community outside Bellingham. They're managing. My father had the surgery and recovered. They're both still working part-time. I see them twice a year, Christmas and Thanksgiving. The conversations are careful. Surface level. How's work? How's the weather? How's your health? We don't talk about the past. We don't talk about Ethan, though I know they still see him regularly. Last month, my mother called and asked if I'd help them figure out their retirement finances. They wanted to know if they had enough saved, if they were on track. She said they trusted me. I said I'd look at their numbers. When we met, I realized they'd been more careful the last few years. They'd been saving a little. Not much, but something. They'd paid down some debt. They were trying. I helped them build a realistic retirement plan. I didn't charge them. When we finished, my father looked at me and said he was sorry. For taking the college fund. For not believing in me the way they believed in Ethan. For everything. My mother was crying quietly. I didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't. But I said I understood why they did it. That they'd believed they were helping. My father said they'd been wrong. I said yes, they had been. We sat there for a while, not talking. Then my mother asked if I thought I'd ever forgive them. I said I didn't know. That forgiveness felt complicated. That I wasn't angry anymore, but I also couldn't forget what I'd learned about who came first in their priorities. She nodded like she understood. Sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. It's about refusing to be destroyed. It's about taking what someone tried to steal and building something they never could. It's about learning that the people who are supposed to protect you won't always do it, and deciding to protect yourself instead. I think about my grandfather sometimes. About the $50,000 he left me with such specific intentions. Half of it vanished into my brother's failed coffee shop. The other half got me through college with debt I shouldn't have needed. But that college fund also taught me something more valuable than anything I learned in a classroom. It taught me to value myself when no one else would. It taught me that contracts matter, that protection matters, that trust is something you verify with paperwork. The distillery is proof I was right. Every month when I review the financial reports, every time I sign off on a distribution deal or approve a new product, I think about how this started as my brother's dream funded with my money. Now it's just mine. Ethan still owes me $14,800 from the college fund repayment. The payment stopped when he signed over his ownership stake, but the original loan agreement is still legally valid. The statute of limitations doesn't run out for another 4 years. I haven't pursued it, not because I've forgiven the debt, because I'm waiting to see if he'll ever acknowledge it himself. If he'll ever reach out and say he wants to make it right. I'm not holding my breath, but I have the paperwork ready, just in case.